This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We further extend this acknowledgement to First Nations people from across Australia and the Torres Strait, or wherever you might be tuning in from. Cities, we all know about them, we all care about them, and we're all a part of them. But just what does it mean to accelerate transitions to a sustainable future? To create deep and diverse connections between people and places? Or to build capacity through collaboration and innovation for the future of our sustainable urban practices? Join us as we hear from those actively engaged in these missions as part of the Our Future Cities organisation.
I would like to say thank you for joining us for the very first episode of the Our Future Cities podcast. Firstly, some introductions. My name's Amelia and I'm a student at Deakin University studying environmental science, and I've been a volunteer member with OFC just since the start of this year. Today I will be interviewing Dr. Paul Satur, who is our wonderful CEO at OFC and a researcher with the Monash Sustainable Development Institute in their Centre for Water Sensitive Cities. Paul has an extensive background in environmental water management, which we're looking forward to hearing about today. So, good morning, Paul. I guess I'd like to start off by asking what inspired the creation of Our Future Cities, and how do you feel like your experience and values in your field are represented by what we're striving for in this organisation?
Hey, Amelia. Thanks for having me on this awesome podcast that you and the crew have been putting together. It's really exciting to see this come to life. I can't wait. So it probably is useful to give some background in terms of my professional career or even just my lived experience. I grew up in a coastal community and was really connected to the marine and freshwater environment as a young guy, and had a real passion kind of developed early in me for the conservation and preservation of those environments, and was working alongside a lot of local activist groups and friends groups and land care groups. And through those sorts of experiences really came to understand the power of community action and the value in building connections of people to place and their environments, and what that can mean for the well-being, not only of people, but in a connected way, the well-being of the natural environment or the ecosystem that people live in as well. And that led me off into university studies and in that direction through environmental science and environmental management degrees, and into the workforce, working community engagement and environmental sort of management based roles throughout parts of Victoria here and Melbourne here in Australia. And in that time, I think what I experienced was a great inequity or inequality in terms of who the sorts of engagement initiatives that we were delivering were actually reaching. So, for example, in the city of Greater Melbourne, there's a quite socioeconomically advantaged community out towards the east, and the further west you head, there's a bit more of kind of a moderate to low socioeconomic community. And we were finding that we didn't have enough river health programs to give people out in the eastern suburbs, where at the same time we had certain quotas to fill out in the western suburbs, and we were cold calling schools and community groups and really trying to work very hard for engagement, and it just wasn't really gaining traction. So those sorts of experiences really led me to heading back to university and undertaking some PhD research looking at the relationship of social inequality to water and livability, and this idea of a water sensitive city. So this concept, this emerging kind of social technical concept of using water to promote livability and resilience and, you know, the vitality of people and places. Now, at that time, what really occurred to me was I'd been through a degree of learning environmental science, how to do natural resource management, and to some extent, how to do integrated water management and water policy. But then sort of having stepped into this kind of research space and this professional water management practice setting, realized very quickly that I needed to learn the language of engineers and needed to learn what architects do and what accountants do and what their role is and what business managers are. Needed to learn this broad spectrum of what we might call interdisciplinary language to really be able to sort of support a change. And in addition to that, was experiencing as a young professional a lot of workplace cultures that often undervalue the sort of expertise that early career professionals brought to their organizations. Which isn't to say that, we were completely shunned, but there was often a bit of a culture for sort of senior figures making decisions and the new early professional being the young learner who joins these organizations and goes through the years of development before they get to a position of having a meaningful input in decision making. It turned out that this was an experience that I was not alone in. So I think all those years ago, 2015, 2016, I was at a party with a friend and having one of those, you know what we should do sort of conversations. And it was really around these very topics. It was this idea that we were both experiencing, these workplace cultures and at the same time having come from graduate and postgraduate studies in which we were sitting alongside some of the leading thinkers and academics that are leading the charge in knowledge area and expertise. And as a result, coming loaded into these organizations with a great deal of knowledge IP and some really unique skills and an ability to think about things differently, but not really having the opportunity to actually roll our sleeves up and become involved. So through that sort of collective mishmash of experiences, that recognition of the need to work in interdisciplinary ways, but having never really learnt it in a university setting, just learnt to be an environmental scientist, or in my friend's experience, having learned to be an engineer, being equipped with these really powerful ideas and new ways of practice that weren't necessarily getting recognized in my workplace. And this recognition that we really need to broaden the dialogue in city shaping and work out ways to more meaningfully engage people of diverse backgrounds and diverse socioeconomic and cultural settings. We came to this conversation to start to think about what would it mean if we started to create an environment that would really allow us to tap into some of those sorts of issues and support outcomes for change by building capabilities for interdisciplinary process early in young emerging professionals, giving them the experience to sit down alongside people from outside of their discipline areas and start to address wicked sustainable development challenges together, to do so in ways that are really place-based or country-centered or culturally centered, where they are working in and alongside not only leading professionals and leading researchers and embracing the forefront of knowledge, but doing it in a way where they're also hearing about the needs and experiences and capacities of the people that live in those environments or care about those environments, to ensure that they're building ways of thinking about those sorts of unique contextual attributes that are important to the way that people live in and value space. And really starting to think about, well, how could we do this in a way where we give young people a voice in city shaping? How can we start to really create an environment where we can produce powerful outputs that we can take to major planning or management and policy organizations and bodies and say, hey, this is what young people want to see for the future of the places they live in. And they've been through this process where they've brought in science, they've brought in communities, they've developed practical solutions that think outside the box as a result. So that's where the origin of this organization came from. It was through some personal professional experiences of those kinds. And since that time, I think it's grown substantially beyond there through a number of different programs and initiatives that have really sought to encompass those values, broadening the dialogue, of supporting a more inclusive approach to city shaping, of empowering young people with not only a voice to advocate for a future they want to see, but also skill sets in interdisciplinary practice, in problem solving, in collaborative engagement, in culturally and contextually sensitive engagement, things like that.
I think what you say about coming in to the professional world as a young person and seeing all these things that need interdisciplinary approach or a more holistic approach, and then not really knowing what to do with it, because as a young person and as a student, everything is new. The whole entire world in front of you is new. And coming from that experience yourself and then actually making something tangible with that and making this collective group is really important, because personally I don't think that there's enough spaces like that for young people, and especially young people in this field. And I think those are the places like our future cities that have the capacity not just to teach us about environmental science or sustainable development, but to teach us about why these people need to be heard and why they need to be heard in different ways. Because the East and the West in a very Victorian context, but I'm sure it can be applied to a lot of different places. Socioeconomically, population demographics, they're all completely different, and it's important that they need to be tailored in different ways. And the only way that you're going to really know how that looks is through having meaningful dialogues with people and meaningful connections with people. So in saying that, I guess I'd like to know if there is a particular experience or story that has been formative in your time in the industry or your decision to create our future cities.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably quite a few. And probably the first biggest one, and when I look back and think about this, there's an irony to it. But, I was a really keen surfer and lived on a sort of a strip of coastline called the Mornington Peninsula, which is an hour to the south of the city of Melbourne. And growing up, there was a kind of infamous surf break down there called Gunnamatta Beach. And it was a pretty wild sort of beach. It was one of those ones that you'd had to be careful if you were not a confident swimmer. But for surfers, it was a really popular place. But it was also home to the Gunnamatta outfall, which was a sewer outfall for the dumping of treated wastewater from Metropolitan Water Authority, Melbourne Water, who would treat the wastewater from the southeast of Melbourne up to Class C standard, then send it out into the ocean quite close to shore. And at the time was being linked to not only a lot of environmental degradation, but also a lot of public health issues. And there was a handful of local advocates groups and not-for-profit volunteer organizations that really started to raise awareness about the impact of that through collecting medical records from people who are surfing in the area, through to more public advocacy with the media and community engagement about actually what was happening there at the time. And that, as a young, early teenager, was a real kind of starting point in starting to recognize the power of people and place, and actually the importance of local voices and building capacity for local communities to be able to participate in decision-making and advocacy. And what that eventually led to, or what the power of that community engagement led to, was an inquiry into the treatment processes that were underway. And through that, a series of interventions that ultimately led to the extension of that outfall pipe and the upgrading of treatment facilities to reduce the environmental and public health impacts that it was having at the time. And it was there that I realized kind of the importance and power of that sort of engagement. That's an early formative one for me that I guess really led me to going, I want to work in this space because I'm interested in the policy and the decision-making processes. But then obviously more recently, there's been experiences in identifying and beginning to see how that actually unfolds in communities that are outside of my own kind of cultural and economic and environmental circumstances. Starting to understand, well, what are the particular tools and things that are needed to really enable these sorts of engagement processes to be more effective across diverse and different communities. And I think what you mentioned there about the importance of processes that are sensitive to context is a really important one. And traditionally, I think a lot of our city shaping and natural resource management bodies have taken a very one-size-fits-all approach to the nature in which they do that. And the result of that is that it works really well for some communities, particularly those that are of a similar kind of socioeconomic and sociocultural background to the people that design the programs in the organizations. But for those that fall outside of those approaches, the engagement is much more limited and the quality of engagement is limited, and therefore people's sense that they have a role to play and that they should care, deteriorates. And as a result, over time, less impactful.
I agree. I think that the kind of experience of understanding that the mechanisms that you're trying to change, whether it be policy or governance, they're both very important and also very limiting. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, and especially in this generation where we are starting to see a huge and very diverse group of young people shift towards governance and policy as a mechanism for creating change. We also see, in congruence with that, more economically privileged countries exploiting and taking advantage of people both within and beyond their borders. And I think that is building this type of skepticism that you speak of. And I think that that's something that really needs to be addressed in conservation practice, in environmental practice. And there's a lot of presumptions that people make about their capacity to engage or their willingness to engage, like you say. So, out of these misconceptions about community engagement or policy, what do you think are the ways that we could manage this, or what are the ways that we could address these misconceptions and move forward to ensure that everybody is engaged with how they can make meaningful differences for sustainable development?
So I think this is really where the power of kind of arts, social sciences, and humanities needs to play a more profound role, which isn't to say that the arts faculties at university aren't doing a good job. I think it's the fact that we don't often teach the power of critical reflection or the power to develop and use a sociological imagination outside of those disciplines. And it's so important in terms of building a capability and a skill set across an industry of people from diverse backgrounds to be able to actually critically step aside from their own cultural and economic and social biases or social ways of seeing the world based on their own sort of upbringings and experiences to meaningfully be able to bracket that and go, okay, what's happening for this community that I'm working in? And what is important when it comes to building infrastructure, when it comes to costing and financing a project or establishing a business model that's going to support meaningful engagement, right through to First Nations groups and traditional custodians, the importance of the connection of people to country and the role that something like revegetation and urban greening processes could potentially play. The protocols around there being sites that are sacred for women and sites that are sacred for men, and the people that actually step into decision-making processes around those. Those are some really small examples that we see popping up time and time again throughout kind of policy and governance, city shaping sort of processes, whereby many of the sort of professionals that we're seeing step into those places don't necessarily have a really in-depth skill set to employ that kind of critical thinking, self-reflection, or sociological imagination to be able to meaningfully engage in those ways that are sensitive and contextually aware from the outset. That's something I think is fundamentally important. Whether or not we see it through universities, we don't know. At the end of the day, there's a lot to cover if you want to be an engineer. So if you're going to add something more in, which is pretty huge like that, what falls off the plate or how do you do it? So there needs to be ways to think about how you can start to give people those sorts of experiences. And I know that's something we've been exploring as part of our future cities. So what role can we play in bringing scientists and mathematicians and fine arts students and planners and architects and roboticists and whoever else together and actually do some processes of decolonizing their perspectives, supporting them to reflect on their cultural upbringing, the sorts of privileges it's allowed them, the sorts of ways it shaped their ability to make decisions and the ways it shaped their worldview to think about issues. Those sorts of skills, we hope, would be invaluable for them to be able to take into any workplace and to start to think about what engagement could look like from a very different perspective than what we have seen in the past.
That's actually funny because the next question we had here was, do you feel that there are any particular disciplines that your industry could benefit from engaging with? And I think conservation science, when intersected with social science, functions at its best. It's in the same way that you can't separate studying global affairs and studying economics. There's certain disciplines that are inherently related, and they inherently have impacts and ramifications for other disciplines. And I think although that may have traditionally been accepted in politics or philosophy, it hasn't necessarily taken the same kind of position in environmental studies and sustainable development studies. The fact that we need that more incorporated framework that does look at anthropology, philosophy, literature, history, they're all things that we can learn from to develop new frameworks that uplift the people that we need to represent. So, like you say, coming from that interdisciplinary approach or a more holistic approach, I'd like to know if there is a particular something that makes you excited about the future of sustainable development and how that relates to our future cities, or something that we're striving for with our future cities.
I need to be careful that I don't just go on like an old man rant here. I think what I've experienced through the work we've done is not only a value and appreciation from young people and diverse communities who we've had the opportunity to have step into this space, but more senior figures throughout different sectors who I think in themselves, in their long running time in being in this space, have seen this kind of perpetuation of the status quo in a lot of practices, this continually doing things the same way, and recognizing that it starts through a process of culturalization in an organization where you come in from a junior perspective, you learn the ways of the world and how things are done, and you familiarize yourself and culturalize yourself with that approach and become comfortable in those particular protocols, of and processes of decision making without necessarily having a complete awareness of it. And that's a pretty common thing. What has occurred to me through the conversations I've had in what we do is that people really value the opportunity to create almost a bit of a risk-free environment, to step in and have a bit of fun in thinking differently. And that process of fun and play, I think, are critical to sustainable development. Because when we look at our planetary boundaries currently, we're on track to just exceed, we've already exceeded several, and it's only getting worse every time there is a planetary boundary report. If we look at things like the IPCC report on climate change, we are still trending in a very negative direction in terms of the way we're addressing human-induced climate change impact. When we look at issues of cultural empowerment, we are still seeing real challenges with the ways that we are connecting or supporting the connection of people to place, or supporting outcomes for country here in Australia, as one example. We've got a long way to go. But I think if we are to really start to fast track positive interventions in addressing some of these challenges, we need to be thinking outside the box. We need to be thinking about, well, how do we as an organization, how do we as a collective community of people start to do things differently? It could be one thing in terms of what you do in your day-to-day, through to a way or a nature in which an organization meaningfully supports engagements in place with communities. It could be a number of things, but it really needs to start, I think, with opportunities for those sorts of people that are driving these outcomes to be able to step into spaces and explore what other opportunities or what other options are on the table, without the consequence of losing their job or having a bad reputation. So when it comes to our future cities, I'm hopeful that what we can do is start to create spaces, capacities for doing things differently in a positive and fun way, and create an environment that can support innovation, to be able to think outside of what the status quo has looked like and go, well, what if we were to look at it this way? And I talked about the senior management and leadership. They turn up because they see the value in that too, in saying, well, actually, we've been doing the same thing for a long time and it hasn't really got us that far down the track. We're still in the same spot. We're still got a long way to go before we meet net zero targets. We've got a long way to go before we're actively engaging our broader community in meaningful ways, before we're decentralizing our infrastructure, for example, to create more kind of place-sensitive outcomes in the built form. We need to think about, well, how might this work differently? But that's hard to do and often can be costly. So I'm hoping that our future cities as an entity that can kind of work between the private sector and the public sector and even community and the education sector, we can play a role in kind of carving out a bit of a space to say, hey, come along and let's have a go at some stuff and see where we get to. Let's understand the issues. Let's understand the context and the people that are connected to those issues. And let's think about what the forefront of knowledge could look like and get creative with it, and see where that takes us.
I think it's a great thing that we're on the forefront of connecting back to what you said at the start. Historically, people have been really attached to rigid ways of thinking and practicing, whether that's internal to organizations or externally as a more broadly social concept, this structure of people that have been in the industry or been in the field for a very long time, building these deep-rooted attachments to, well, this is just how we do things here. This is just how it happens. And I think that approach, although it has some value, and having an approach that is rooted in structure and history and understanding of how things work, bringing innovation and bringing new voices into long-standing systems is really important. And we have pushed a lot of our planetary boundaries, and I think old habits have led us to push a lot of those planetary boundaries to the precipice of a very catastrophic demise. And so I think that what is going to bring us forward, or what is going to even come in and save us, is innovation and is newness. And I think it's nice to remain hopeful about these.
Yep. Totally. And the thing that comes to mind as we're talking about this is this isn't about anarchy, coming in and just blazing the trail and pushing everyone out of the way because they don't know what they're talking about. It's one of kind of being humble and humility and being inclusive. And it's also not necessarily profound in some respects either. This sort of way of thinking, I'm not a prophet that's about to come in and change the world as we know it. And I'm currently sitting on Wurundjeri land as part of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. And I often love telling this story that I read about a little while ago from Auntie Doreen Garvey-Wandin, who was a Wurundjeri elder, who tells this story of the Dulai Walang, a creature found in the waterways of Wurundjeri land. And she tells the story of, a young hunter who had become headed and lost their way. So was transformed by the creation mother into the Dulai Walang, who had a tail that looked like its nose because it had lost its way. And she was referring to a species also referred to as the platypus. And she, in that story, says, to this day, when Wurundjeri people see the Dulai Walang in the waterways of Wurundjeri, they are reminded to be humble and to respect country and to keep the culture alive, which for me really resonates in terms of what we're talking about here. It's about thinking about culture and place, and to do so in a humble, inclusive way, and recognize the deep interconnectedness of those people and of people with place, both in time throughout history, but also in terms of the future and what that could mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is such a great story to finish up with. And I think it's an image to ponder over in terms of what's to come, offer some self-reflection. But yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for this interview. It's been a pleasure, and it's been great to talk to you today. And we're looking forward to what's next.
Totally. Awesome. It's been great to hang out, and I love a chat as much as the next person, as you probably well know by now. So delighted to be a part of this and really excited to see what's coming up as well. Stay tuned, listeners.
Yeah, very exciting stuff.
You've been listening to the Voices of the Our Future Cities organisation. To find out more, head to ourfuturecities.org or hit us up at our.future.cities.au@gmail.com.